Hello and welcome to the Data Pipeline webinar series. Today we will be having a strategic discussion around cloud strategy and where it fits in data pipelines. We'll cover some market insight, hear about client success, and various solutions for different cloud architectures. So before we get started, a few notes. This session is being recorded and the recording will be made available and emailed to you in the next day or so. Additionally, we will be conducting 2 polls during the webinar and encourage your feedback to help our presenters tailor their presentations to your specific interests and needs. And plus, at the end of this webinar, we will randomly draw 2 names of attendees that participated in the polls to win Amazon gift cards. So that's exciting. And last note, we will have a Q&A wrapping up the presentation. So we encourage you to utilize the Q&A panel, which can be located at the bottom right of your Zoom window to type your questions as we go along. A few introductions. My name is Rachel Mason. I'm the marketing specialist here at Technion Data Solutions, helping out with this webinar series. And Technion is excited to be hosting this series along with 3 other exciting series on visual analytics, data science, and data strategy. So be sure to check out upcoming sessions on our website. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to today's speakers, Teknion National Sales Director, Michael Tantrum, and Teknion CTO, Jonathan Agee.
Thank you, Rachel. And as Rachel said, welcome to our webinar series. So my name's Michael Tantrum, National Sales Director, and with me, Jonathan, who's our CTO. And between us, we have over 50 years of data warehouse experience. And so we're very excited to be able to share our experience with you and hope that you will enjoy it as much as we will. So a quick review of our data pipeline webinar series. So back in February, we had our very first one this year, which was around data pipeline strategy. There are elements of that webinar which we'll have in this webinar, but you should review that webinar to look at more of the data pipeline. In April, we had 2. We had one around data quality, data wellness using the Technion Validator Data QA tool. And we also had a tool-specific one looking at Matillion, which is a cloud ETL tool. In July, we had two different webinars. The first one was tool focused, looking at Snowflake as a cloud data platform. And then we also had another tool focused one, Warescape, which is a key player in data warehouse automation within the data pipeline world. All of those webinars, you can find the recordings in the webinars archive on our Technion website. Today, we're going to look at cloud strategy and data pipeline. And then in October, we're going to have an updated data pipeline strategy one as well. Also, check out our other series. These are on the website. We have, as well as the data pipeline series, we have a data strategy series, visual analytics series, and a data science series. For those people who don't know Technion, let me introduce you quickly to the company. We're a full service data solutions consulting firm. So anything data, anything analytics, that's where we live and we breathe. Founded in '98, we're based in Central Texas. A little over 400 clients, and I say 65 staff. We're continuously growing, so I might be a little out of date with that. We have 4 main practices, 4 pillars upon which we base our company. The first is data pipeline, and so this encompasses ETL, data warehousing, data transformation, data modeling, basically all of the effort to acquire and store data for analytic purposes. The second practice is data visualization. This is how we take that data that we've collected and stored, and we present that out to our business users for consumption. The third pillar is data science. Now, data science is quite exciting because this is about what's happening tomorrow. So most of our analytics in the past has been focused on what happened yesterday. Data science is take what happened yesterday, see if you can predict what's going to happen tomorrow. And finally, data governance. How do we make sure that we have people and process and technology in place to ensure that our data practices are well governed? We have good recognition in the industry. These are just 4 of the main technology partners we have who we enjoy very close relationships with. So Warescape from a data pipeline, data warehouse automation, Alteryx from data blending, data science, analytics, Tableau for visualization, and of course Snowflake for cloud partnerships. Now today, what we're going to cover off is cloud adoption and trends. So what's happening in the world? What are we seeing amongst our clients? Where do we think the market's going? Then we're going to look at cloud architecture. So what are the pieces that make up a good data platform in the cloud? And then finally, what we're going to do is look at considerations for data pipelines in the cloud and what that might mean for a successful cloud implementation. Now I have Jonathan with me. Jonathan is vastly experienced in the technologies here. And Jonathan, perhaps you can talk to us, perhaps you can start the discussion here about some of the stories we're seeing from the field.
Sure thing. Thank you, Michael. Nice to have you all joining us today. Looking forward to this conversation. So we're going to start off with a little bit of conversation, as Michael said, around what we're seeing in the industry from a cloud adoption perspective. And we're going to actually kick that off with Rachel starting a poll for us so that we can see from those on this call what is your cloud adoption, and then as we go through, you'll get to see the results of that. So Rachel, if you can pop that up, that would be great. And then I'll just set us up for this. As Michael said, we're going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing out in the industry from some of the analysts, and then I'm actually going to take you through some statistics that we've collected from our experience in the space, in our projects that we've been doing over the last several years. So hopefully you all can answer that poll, and we'll just give you about 10 more seconds, and then we'll move on and start talking about what we're seeing the analysts telling us about cloud adoption. All right, Michael, if you can move on to the next slide. So we're going to look at the enterprise space first, and what we're seeing from Forbes here is that by 2020, between the public and private clouds, 83% of enterprise workloads are actually being handled now in the cloud. So this has been a really dramatic shift in the last few years. And anecdotally, from my experience, this has been something that we've watched in our client base very rapidly. It was something that started about 2 years ago in the central region. The pace of adoption just really ratcheted up. We cover clients across the nation, and so some of our clients in other regions had started adopting earlier. But what we've seen is that it's really ratcheted up. So 94% of enterprises actually are using the cloud. That comes from Flexera. And then I think this is a really interesting one, that 66% of enterprises already have a central cloud team or a center of excellence. Now, this is an area where if you're not one of those 66%, or maybe you're not in the enterprise sector where you can afford to have really this centralized cloud center of excellence, this is an area where Technion could support you with some of these best practices for cloud adoption and things like that. So then if we look at the small and medium business sector, really impressive here that 78% of small businesses are fully adopting cloud tech computing here already by 2020. I think this is driven a lot by software as a service factors. And then this one was a really, really powerful one. A lot of people are concerned about the cloud from a security perspective, but what Microsoft is telling us is that they're hearing from their customers that 94% of small businesses are seeing actually security benefits after moving to the cloud. So I think that idea of outsourcing your security to someone who's really focused on it is a really powerful thing. And then clearly cost is a big driver. 82% of small medium businesses are seeing reduce costs because of cloud adoption. So what I'd like to do next is take you through a little bit of Teknion's experience and share some statistics with you on what we've seen from our client base for specifically for data warehouse projects. This is looking at our data warehouse projects, and we've analyzed over the last 6 years worth of projects and looked at what has that trend of adoption in our client base look like. And so you can see that really back in 2015, 100% was really in that on-premise, kind of architecture. And then from there, a couple of years of slow adoption, and then you can see the rapid adoption that kicked in really kind of in that 2 to 2.5 years ago timeframe in 2018 and 2019. And then our client base looks like it's really mimicking what we're seeing from the industry analysts in and around kind of that 70 to 80% really starting of all computing being in the cloud. So our data warehouse projects are really following the same trend that the industry has. And then Michael, if you go to the next slide, this is the same data, just one more level of detail drilled in, and that is showing you some of the shift that we've seen in our data warehousing practice around which platforms, specifically calling out which platforms are really the drivers for those projects. And so you can see that SQL Server has really shifted, and a lot of those projects that we previously had on SQL Server have now started to shift into the cloud with Snowflake being a really dominant player in that ecosystem. So you're going to hear a little bit more of these stories coming back to how this has impacted us and where we've played roles and things like that as we go through the rest of the webinar. But with that, let me hand it back over to Michael, and he'll talk a little bit about some of the why and what's going on here in the landscape.
Yeah, so people aren't moving to the cloud just because. So there are changes in the way that businesses are operating that are driving this cloud, and you probably will resonate with a lot of these. And the first is what we call the data center of gravity. So if you think of the center of gravity of your data, whether it's on premise, on the ground, if you like, or the sources being in the cloud, we're starting to see a shift of the center of that being to the cloud. So more and more of the sources of our data for our analytics are becoming cloud. So whether that's tools like Salesforce or other cloud services and things like that, but we're seeing more and more sources move to the cloud. And so that's driven a shift to cloud data warehousing. The next thing that's a change in the data landscape that's driving this is scalability. The need to be able to handle a rapid rise in data growth, and that's both in volume and breadth of subject area. And so the ability to apply resources faster than we've ever needed to in the past. In the past, you might have had a 5 or a 10-year plan for sizing your equipment for data warehousing. Well, now you just can't do that because the data is growing just too rapidly. And the other problem with scalability is we only want to pay for the resources we need at the time we need them. And so the need to have the right amount of computing power at the moment, at the second that I need it, is becoming important. Driving that, of course, is cost structure. So in the past, I would have sized up my data warehouse project. I would have gone and priced up an appliance like a Teradata or an Agee appliance. I would have invested 7 figures in this big capital expenditure, and then I would have amortized that over the following 10 years. Now people are saying we don't want to do capital expenditure. We want to operationalize our costs. We want to pay for what we use when we use it. So this pay-as-you-go model, subscription-based pricing for online storage and tools and computing power. And so people are wanting to say, I only want to pay when I use it, not in anticipation of future use. And the final driver we're seeing is a change in skill set. So in the past, where organizations would have had large in-house infrastructure roles, so system administrators, network administrators, DBAs, those sort of maintenance support roles, what people are saying is that's not core to our business. And you have cloud providers like, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. These guys have very, very good infrastructure. So let's outsource that to other people, other organizations, so that we can focus on what's core to our business, which is building our analytic practice, building our analytics, supplying data to our end users to make good decisions. But we're not got people focused on that maintenance of security and backups and networks and things like that. So having seen those changes in the data landscape, now let's talk about Technion and the sort of things that we do when the role of Technion in our clients' cloud adoption journey. And so initially people would say to us, look, can you come and have a look at what we've built, our existing data warehouse, do a health check, tell us whether we're doing a good job, whether it's structured appropriately and correctly. And out of that, people would say, okay, well, this seems okay for today. What about for tomorrow? And so we then moved into the field of strategic assessments and guidance. So, should you go to the cloud? Does the cloud make sense for your organization? What might that look like? What does that look like in terms of resourcing and roles and utilization? And then how might you get there? How do we get from a world of today to a world of tomorrow? So moving data and things like that. And that led us into the next area of walking with our clients on this journey of migration. How do we move from an on-premise world to the cloud? And so when we talk about data migration, there are many things to migrate. The three heavy lifters are your data structures, your data pipelines, so think of that as your ETL processes, and also the data itself. Now, of course, there's lots of other things you need to consider, like users and roles and schema layouts and things like that. But these are the three big heavy lifters here. Okay, so we've moved to the cloud. We've got our existing warehouse in the cloud. What now? Well, there's a lot of training and enablement we do. So how do we work in this new cloud environment? How does that change the way we self-service data to our end users? How do we service the loading and transforming data, perhaps at a pace that we're not used to? And then the next step from there, of course, is the data warehouse modernization. So how do we go from being craftsmen to becoming engineers? How do we take a world where traditionally we've manually created an awful lot of our world around coding and documentation and deployments and testing, and take that into a world of automation, using tooling to do things that we don't want humans to do, metadata and governance. So that's kind of the part that Technion has played with our clients in their journey. Now, Jonathan, perhaps can you now take us and describe to us, what do we mean by data pipeline?
Sure thing, and that's really getting at the heart of what the topic for today, right? What is our cloud strategy, and how does that impact our data pipelines? Well, we got to make sure we understand what is this idea of a data pipeline all about. And if you go back, and I'll refer you back to our previous webinar for data pipeline strategy, there's some really great discussions in there about what do we mean by that. But here's a definition that we're using, and that is that the role of data pipelines is to gather, govern, document, and deliver data to various end states. And that end states of the data is the places where it lives, right, to support successful execution of your data analytics strategy. And so really it's all those things that encompass getting the data from where it's created, your source systems, IoT, whatever those are, web data, and bringing it into your data warehouse platform, your data lake, whatever that is, and ultimately delivering it to those end users. So Michael, if you can go to the next slide, I want to put kind of how we think of data pipelines in context. So this is an architecture diagram that we use for thinking about the overall data and analytics space and the different disciplines and pillars, as Michael mentioned, that we work within. So we have our data pipelines discipline and pillar, and it's a big area. It's a lot of different types of activities. We have our data science discipline, and that is, you know, a lot of that advanced analytics and producing those predictive results for folks. A huge part, obviously, of your data and analytics is how you're going to present that to your end users. So that's our visual analytics discipline. And then, you know, data is not only useful for those end users to consume, but to be integrated and brought together with other areas of the business. And so we have our integrated apps pillar there. So we're going to zoom in now on data pipelines and talk a little bit about how we're going to tackle this subject for today's webinar around how do we think about the cloud. And so what we're going to do is take this specific diagram and we're going to break it up into 4 different areas. And so Michael, if you go to the next slide, we're going to talk about cloud data platform and kind of how you can select and make sure you're on the right track from understanding what cloud data platform you would want to leverage. We're going to talk about your data lake strategy. Should you have one? What should it look like? How should you use it? Those sorts of things. Data loading and streaming is all about how do we get that data into our data platform. And then data modeling and transformation. What should it look like for my end users or for intermediate states along the way, for storage, all of that stuff, and how should we accomplish that transformation? Particularly, we're going to bring the conversation back in each of these. We're going to talk about general strategy, but we're also going to bring it back to how does this change and shift as we think about it from a cloud perspective, right? What's different in the cloud that we need to make sure we touch on and you all have a good understanding of. All right, so Michael, you're going to kick us off with the cloud data platform and give us an overview of that.
Yeah, and we're using the term cloud data platform only because it slightly encompasses a little more than a cloud data warehouse. So you'll see the middle section here that we've got highlighted in blue, cloud data warehouse. That's what we're going to focus on this next step. So when you choose a cloud data platform, what are the things to consider? There's several offerings out there, and the things you want to think about. Let's start with the first one, which is around cost. Now, almost all of them work on a pay-as-you-go model. Some of them combine the concept of storage. So how much physical disk space am I taking up with the data that I'm putting in there? And compute every time I process data, whether it is loading data into that storage, whether I'm transforming data inside that storage, or whether I'm querying it out through my end user layer. So both of those contain a cost. Some of the cloud platforms have a combined cost where storage and compute are together, others separated out. And so depending on your use case, you might want to consider different options there. The next thing to think about is rapid scaling up and down. So those of you who've been doing this sort of work for a while will know that your usage pattern is not flat. You know, your month end, you might do a month end run where you're loading more data. Perhaps you're doing a history load where you've got a vast volume of data that you're loading, but just as a one-off. And so you want to look for a cloud platform that will allow you to scale up in terms of resourcing quickly for when you need it, and scale down. So some of them scale up fast and down slow. Some of them scale up fast and down fast. The next thing to think about is ease of migration. How easy is it going to be for me to take my existing world, let's say, you know, your on-premise SQL Server or Oracle or Netezza. IBM's killed Netezza, so that's a common one we're talking about at the moment, to move that into a cloud world. How easy is that going to be? Another thing to think about is data sharing. So in a cloud world, now that I've got data centralized, I have many users potentially of the same data set. Rather than making copies of the data, I would want to make that data available to different users in different ways, perhaps with different security. So the concept of data sharing is a thing that the cloud has made significantly easier. And so you want to look at the different ways that the different cloud platforms handle data sharing. Now, workload supported. There's lots of different types of workloads that you're going to do, whether it's loading data, it's transforming data, it's querying data out, and things like that. So different types of workloads incur different volumes and have different aspects to it. Now, Jonathan, you've done a lot of work around this. Would you like to add some thoughts around the workloads, different types of workloads to be considered?
Yeah, and thanks, Michael. I think this is one of the key reasons why we're using the word platform here and not just data warehouse, because the data warehouse function of serving up those analytic requests, and as well as storing data, that in a structured way, that's one workload, right? The workload we're going to be talking about next of data lake, right? That's another workload. But along the way, you have these workloads of data transformation and data engineering, right? Michael mentioned kind of like, how do you get into that mindset of engineering? And then of course, if your data is all in this data platform, that's where you want to be doing your data science workloads. That's where you want to be building applications that are integrated in and show those visual analytics right in an embedded way. And then, Michael mentioned data sharing, and I think data sharing goes beyond that internal sharing and can really turn into kind of a business use case of how do I share data even outside my organization and monetize it. And so all of these type of workloads are those that you need to consider, not just for, what is my first use case, but where do I want to go as an organization with my strategy for my data and analytics platform, and your core of your cloud data platform, where that's going to be stored and how that's going to work is really what's going to enable that. So I think that's what we mean when we think about workloads supported, is there's more to consider here that you might not have been thinking of.
Yeah, and sort of coming out of that is that as you increase the number of users on your platform into the hundreds or thousands or even tens of thousands, the thing you have to think about then is concurrency. I have these data sets. Perhaps if I'm monetizing my data out to my clients, I have no idea of the volumes of users there. So we have to think about the concepts of concurrency and contention. Some of the data platforms are designed to handle this very well. Some of them are less likely to. So if you have a large number of users, this is something you're going to want to consider. Another thing to think about is semi-structured data. So more and more and more of our data is coming to us now as JSON or Parquet files and things like that. And so in the past, those were annoying to deal with, in the old days in Oracle, these were hard to work with. But we need to be able to have good native handling of semi-structured data, because it seems to be becoming an important part of the future, data coming out of message queues and sensors and IoT equipment and things like that. And then finally, the thing to think about is the ecosystem. Who else in the industry is using this? What other tooling is available? What other apps are available to integrate with this? What are the skill sets available? What's the industry adoption looking like? Jonathan, do you have any thoughts around the ecosystem you'd like to add?
Well, I think that's part of what we're going to talk about on the next slide, really around kind of the cloud vendor platforms versus more of a software as a service. And the key is really, are you kind of trying to look at a centralized solution around a cloud vendor platform, or are you looking at, maybe a software as a service data platform that ties together with a lot of the other tooling in the cloud? I think the key is you want tools that are about automation, and you want tools that are about being cloud centric and native, so that you're taking the benefits of cloud from the get-go.
Yeah, so we have the three big cloud vendors, of course, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google. And the most typical data warehousing databases in those worlds are Redshift, Azure Synapse, and then Google BigQuery. Jonathan, do you want to tell us a little bit about sort of in the cloud vendor world, the idea of leveraging cloud services from these guys and how you might put together an ecosystem, your cloud platform, and how that might differ. We'll talk about software as a service in a minute, but just maybe expand a little more for us what the cloud vendor world looks like.
Yeah, so we're seeing this a lot with some of our customers, where we're seeing, an enterprise or a small medium business really selects a cloud vendor, right, and says, I want to work in AWS, or I want to work in Azure, right, and they get that relationship set up, and that becomes an easy place for them to say, let's put everything inside of this environment, right. And what we're seeing is, then you can take advantage of things like the native message queues, the native storage layers, where should I land my data? Well, if I'm in Azure, I'm going to, use Azure Blob Storage. If I'm in AWS, I might use S3 or something like that. What we're seeing, though, is that does require you to begin putting all of those pieces together. And so for some businesses that have built up that cloud expertise, that those muscles are exercised, and you're used to doing that, not just for your data and analytics pipelines and such, but also for your operational world. And so we see folks putting together a really strong platform, data platform, that integrates all of those elements. Now, usually that's within a cloud, right? So that's something that we're seeing a lot of, but then there's another option, and that's what we want to make sure, everyone is aware of, kind of the two options you have here. So Michael, tell us about software as a service.
Yeah, so the idea with software as a service is that the service takes care of all of those things behind the scenes, like, managing storage, managing, those other things like messaging queues and things that Jonathan was talking about. And so probably the big example here is Snowflake. The other options you tend to see would be the cloud versions of the on-premise databases. So Oracle's cloud offering, Teradata's cloud offering, for example. And so the big advantage of this is that you don't need the whole cloud environment. You don't need to spin up a whole world of AWS or Azure. It's really easy to get started. You put your credit card in the AWS marketplace, you're ready to go on Snowflake. It's really that easy. The other advantage of the software as a service is it allows you to cross cloud. So maybe today you're on AWS, and the future you decide to switch to Azure. The software as a service platforms, particularly something like Snowflake, actually makes that crossing the platforms particularly easy. Jonathan, did you want to expand on?
I think you covered that really well.
Yeah. Yeah, and so depending on which way you're leaning, if you're thinking about cloud and you're not quite sure what this looks like for you, give us a call. We're very happy to talk it through. Sometimes different options make different sense for different purposes. Okay, so Jonathan, let's talk data lake.
Yeah, and in this diagram, when you look at it, it may look a little strange. We've got a box called data lake, and then we've got replicated source data, and we're highlighting both of them. What does that mean? And I think that's kind of the crux of it, is that a data lake is kind of what you want it to be in your world. And there's lots of different use cases that make sense. And there's lots of different flavors of how we've seen data lakes be successful. So what I want to take you through first is why we almost always recommend some form of a data lake. And so I want to highlight for you 3 use cases and 3 benefits. On the 3 use cases side, really data lake, when you think about it from the context of just moving your source data in a raw form into some sort of structure that lets you have access to it, your rapid data discovery and prototyping can become really easy. And so we have access to it, we can get to it, and this is where you may not know what's in your data, but you want to accomplish something with it from a source system, your CRM data or your billing system data, whatever it might be. If I could just have access to it outside of the environment where I'm gonna, hurt my source system or tax it in some way, I can really begin to analyze that and prototype. It's also a very natural landing area for semi-structured data. Now, as we talked about before, depending on what you've chosen for your cloud data platform, that may be in files, or it may be in a database that supports semi-structured data. And I think one area that we see a lot of folks using a data lake for is that long-term storage of original data. So just having it accessible, but not having to have changed its format and kind of built out all the structures for how you're going to store it. So on the 3 benefits side, then what we see is that a data lake can really be a really good starting point for a project for someone who doesn't yet have a strong cloud data pipeline environment, because we can get some really quick wins out of it. We can get data in and begin doing that prototyping. And then in the long run, it increases your team's agility with data, because that data is accessible and ready to go, and with the right tool sets, you can just come in and get those pieces that you need without having to spin up a whole big project around having built that out. And then as you do spin up projects, the data accessibility and loading into the cloud has been taken into account already with bringing the data into a data lake, and we don't have to have as much work in that step in future projects. So those are 3 use cases and 3 benefits. And then let's talk a little bit more about, you know, some of the considerations, kind of back to what should it mean for you, and what should you think about in terms of a data lake. So really, I think it's all about, what are you going to use it for? What of those benefits are you really targeting? What are you really trying to achieve? And you have to think about it from the standpoint of, what data do I have that I would be putting in, right? What are the formats? Is this primarily, you know, data from databases? Is this primarily web data from web logs or things like that? Do I have a lot of IoT or a lot of file data? I think, and another area I'll highly recommend going back and watching the data pipeline strategy, because we really dissect these different types of data and some of how you should think about them. But ultimately, whether it's structured, semi-structured, or unstructured, that's going to define a direction for you. Can I get away with just doing this in a database, or do I need a hybrid or file-based solution? I would suggest almost always using some flavor of a SQL access layer for it if you can. That's going to be a huge benefit in the long run. And then, do you need long-term storage of data, or is it disposable? That's something that is, you know, is really dependent on your use case. And then, how do you keep it from turning into a data swamp, right? We don't want that to happen. So governance is key, and setting ground rules, and that's an area where Technion can come in and help you set up that initial architecture with strong governance. So the data lake is an important piece of the architecture, and we believe that at least getting that data out of source systems and accessible in the cloud is a really important step for folks to start with.
Okay, so now that we've got data, we talked about how we store it and the benefits of the cloud platform versus the data lake. Now we want to talk about how to get data into the cloud. I often call this the day one problem, because when people are starting to think about cloud, once they've chosen the cloud platform, the one big hurdle, that the enormous thing in front of them, is how do we get data in? And they spend a huge amount of time and effort thinking about how do I load data? And that's why I call the day one problem. Later on, in a couple of slides, we're going to talk about data transformation and modeling, and that's what I call the day two problem. So once I've landed it, what do I do with it? So let's talk about the hard stuff of data loading and streaming. So the first thing you have to think about is data sources. So different types of data sources require different strategies. And so, you know, if you've got files, or if your source is a database, maybe your source is an API or a message queue, all of these different objects can have different technologies and different strategies about how to get it in. We also have to think about things like, am I going to do a full load? Maybe it's a flush and fill approach, or maybe it's an incremental load, or maybe I'm doing a rolling window. So all of these different things to consider, and my source data dictates a lot of my strategies. So if we look on the bottom here, we talk about the different timing frequencies. Traditionally overnight, midnight, once a day load was typical. Then we see more and more work where people are saying, during the day, I need an update. People then started to look at micro batch. What happens if I try to load the data every 5 minutes? Near real time, so not instantaneous, but within a very short time after the data has changed in the source system, I want to see it, or true real time. And so each of these different approaches has impacts on source systems. Now, when we go to the cloud, the impacts change. So in a cloud world, the differences between a traditional on-premise database and cloud is that cloud, you have to move the data into the cloud before you can typically load it. And so in the past, the movement of data on premise wasn't a headache unless you had very bad network topology and things like that. But traditionally, the movement of data was the easy part. The hard part was loading it into the target platform. Now, in a cloud world, the move to the cloud is now significant and can be problematic. So you have to start thinking about some of these concepts, a bit like the impact on source systems. And then the technology. So classically, when we're batching it, we've done things like scripting it. And even if we're using tools for this, it's effectively a script. It's a query against the source, query from source, insert into target. And that data has to move up and through files typically, and then gets loaded. As we get to more real time, and particularly when you're starting to talk about things like sensor data and web logs and things like that, now we start to think about the concept of streaming. And so how do we stream that into our target platform? And of course, the real time, now we're talking about CDC and replication. So just some tool examples to think about depending on the style of loading you're going to do. Of course, with batch, you could do it manually. At Technion, we would discourage you from that because we think that's very much last decade's technology, and the tooling out there to enable automation is just is a huge game changer in the way we approach our data warehouses. In the Azure world, you've got tools like Azure Data Factory, you've got tools like Warescape, you've got tools like Matillion. This is not meant to be exhaustive, of course, it's just some examples, particularly ones that Teknion has experience in. Streaming, you've got things like Fivetran. Fivetran is a web-to-web streaming thing to load data from a source like a Salesforce into something like a Snowflake target, and then stream sets is another streaming technology. And then if you're talking CDC, HVR is a good choice there. Okay, so having talked about loading data and streaming it, now let's talk about what it looks like to model and to transform it. So Jonathan, tell us what you think is important to consider here from a cloud world.
Yeah, and so we really kind of have a little bit of two topics kind of in one here, but they go so hand in hand. I think it's really important to talk about them together. First and foremost is what are the structures for your data that you're going to choose, right? And so that's kind of getting into the model. What is it that how should you approach this? So if you go to the next slide, and again, I'm going to point you back to our data pipeline strategy and webinar, and we talked about three broad approaches. One was kind of your data warehouse centric approach, or I called it classic Kimball in that webinar. And this is where you really do that typical thing of conforming your dimensions, building out subject areas. Some folks might call it kind of a data mart approach. And I think this is a good solution for certain businesses. We see this, we've seen it a lot in legacy data warehouse implementations and when we're migrating them. And we see it a lot in kind of those mid-size organizations with strong departmental reporting needs. And I think this is an approach that's powerful, it's proven, But it's also doesn't account for some of the things like what do I do with the data lake and how do I handle kind of that more variety of data and things like that. So we've also seen another broad approach, and that is kind of the data lake centric approach. And that's where you make your data lake kind of front and center. You put all data through that data lake, and then you build as needed governed data processes that bring data into data marts for end user access. But one of the hallmarks of this is that you really have, you know, that bottom arrow that kind of bypasses and goes through the sandbox area there. You have folks that access that data lake directly and are seeing significant business value from that data lake because they're, and that's where that agility comes from, the ability to access lots of data in real time. So if you have a really heavy, you know, data science world, this is one we see a lot of. But it's important that there are those data marts that are built out in good, clean structures for folks that need that more governed perspective on the data. The third and final one here that we're looking at from a data modeling perspective is a pattern that has really accelerated here in the US in the last few years. And we've learned this from Dan Lindstedt, the kind of father of Data Vault. And he's pioneered this idea of a data vault, which is really all about storing that perfect version of the truth that replicates where the data where it came from in your source system at the time, and you can recreate that at any time. And not only is it a modeling approach, but it's also a business approach of how you run the project and how you can bring that in with speed and accuracy and do it over time. And so there's some real benefits from a data vault perspective for organizations that are dealing with lots of data streaming in, needing to handle that in real time, as well as organizations that are dealing with very kind of structured requirements around governance. You can think of banking, insurance, financial services, where you have strong auditing and needing to be able to recreate at any point in time. And so there's this real value placed on the modeling techniques and how you can store that data. All of that to say, go back and listen to the previous webinar because we dive into those in a lot more detail there. But these modeling approaches are ones that you should consider. Where do I fall into in terms of what my needs are that drive these? And what you'll see is some consistency in this. You're gonna have data marts. You're gonna have those access layers, right? So you need to think about your data transformation in terms of supporting that, no matter which one of these you choose. But then what are those data transformations that leverage what a data lake brings to the table and all of that? So as we look at data transformation, you have some considerations in and around the build process. And it's really important, and this is really critical as you look at the cloud. And I'll start with this and then talk about some of these bullet points. One is that you need to look at extract, load, transform tools, not extract, transform, and load, right? So ELT versus ETL. And that is really critical because once we've got the data in the cloud, we don't want to be consistently pulling it in and pulling it out. So all the tools that we would recommend that are cloud native are going to follow that paradigm. But you also need to look at automation. How much am I going to be able to automate with that tool set, right? Is it handling primarily the, the running of my data pipeline, moving the data through and transforming it? Or is it handling also the design side of things, the deployment side of things, documentation, daily operations? Does it help me build my objects in my data warehouse, right? Is it going to create that DDL for me? And does it support virtualized and physical models? Because that's a very important thing, that the cloud and this scalable compute lets us virtualize more of the model so that we don't have as many copies of the data stored that we have to update. And then what type of code is it? Is it going to be a black box? that we don't have access to, or is it native SQL or scripting that's going to do those transformations in there? And then how are you going to handle data quality and data quality assessment and testing in the development process? And then if we look at it from a governance perspective, you know, some of these areas are really no different than what you would do in a non-cloud environment, but are super important to mention. And that is, you know, what are we doing about documentation, data dictionary, lineage, and impact analysis? Particularly, you know, making sure that as we look at new cloud technologies, they fit into and work within our governance models that we build out. And then where are we storing and managing our metadata? How are we making sure that we have visibility into that metadata and can leverage it for the things we need? And then finally, a reference back, and it's a passion of Teknion's around our tool set called Validator that Michael mentioned earlier. Data quality is really critical as we not only build, but as we operationalize. And so if you're looking at the entire ecosystem, oftentimes that's an area that's forgotten. So with that, Michael, any other comments from your perspective on the data transformation side of things?
Yeah, no, just to absolutely agree with you there that one of the big things that people forget is the governance side. And if you're going to take the leap to the cloud, in a world of data warehouse modernization, take advantage of the latest thinking around things like governance and metadata and automation. It'll make your life easier, not just at build time, but you know, if you're the person who gets the phone call at 3 in the morning in a year's time, you want life to be easy for you. So yeah, so take the opportunity with the cloud. So if we come back to Technion as your trusted partner, you know, as you journey through the cloud, just to recap the things we can help with. Perhaps while I go through these, Rachel, can you pop up another poll for us? This one will look at the things that are your biggest challenge on your cloud journey, and everybody has different challenges. And we're here to help with them. But it's interesting also for us to be able to see from your perspective the things that you find hard and not just what we think is hard. So again, the things around health check and reviewing your existing world, strategic data assessment. Is the cloud the right thing for us and how do we get there? Data migration, the mechanics of actually getting to the cloud and setting up our new environment, training and enablement to get there, and then the whole data warehouse modernization around all of the topics we've talked about today. So I notice we're very close to time. I'd like to take questions from people if they've had any. So let's switch to taking some questions here, and feel free to use the Q&A panel in Zoom, and Rachel, I'll let you coordinate the questions as they come in for us.
That sounds great. Thanks, Michael and Jonathan. Great presentation. Yes, the Q&A panel is found at the bottom right of your Zoom window. And actually, we have one question. Does your approach to data governance change in a cloud world?
Jonathan, would you like to take a first stab at that?
Sure. I think in general, you know, there's kind of two sides of data governance. There's the side of accessing the data and understanding what you have and things like that. And so when you're in a cloud world, your tool sets are somewhat different and things like that. So that may change slightly, right? But your tool sets that you use for data governance need to support those. You need to consider that obviously as you make any considerations there. But the core of what data governance is about people and processes. And so really not as much of the actual people and processes change when you're in that cloud world. You really are still doing a lot of the same activities. So not too much, but it's important that your partner for data governance understands the cloud and understands what some of the options are that you can do differently in the cloud than what you could do on premise.
Yeah, and my only comment to add to that would be data governance means many things to many people, and it means much more than just QA and a data dictionary. So we're happy to talk to you about that.
Great. And then we have another question. Can you talk about the skills that will be needed for cloud architects, engineers, maintenance, operations?
Yeah, I think that comes back to what we were talking about, whether you're going with a cloud vendor platform or with the software as a service platform. The software as a service platform, particularly a tool like Snowflake, the need for DBAs is significantly reduced. The service manages an awful lot of the things traditionally that a DBA would. You don't have to manage the actual OS or anything like that. The service manages that. If you're on the cloud vendor side, then you're going to need some more there. And perhaps, Jonathan, you'd like to add color?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's a really great question, and thank you for asking it. I think there's one skill that no matter what your options are, I think is really critical when it comes to data pipelines, and that is SQL. We've seen SQL continue to be really a core skill across the board. When you think about it from a cloud vendor perspective, like Michael was saying, stitching together those different functions within kind of a cloud ecosystem, it's really important to understand, APIs, how you're going to do scripted functions, becoming very familiar with your cloud vendors, so the certifications that go along with that. But if you can choose the right tool sets that are SQL centric, that are somewhat software as a service, those also will simplify the skill sets that you have to worry about making sure you have in-house. The ideas of architecting and things like that are still similar. You still have to architect, you still have to design well. And so that hasn't changed from what you would do on premise in a traditional world.
Great. And then we had one quick question about if the recording will be made available. And yes, the recording will be emailed out in the next day or so. And as well, all the recordings for previous webinars are located on our website in the webinar archive. So those are easy. And then I guess that will be all the time we have today for questions, but in the follow-up email, we will include both Michael's and Jonathan's emails. Feel free to email any additional questions that you may have that we were unable to answer today. And I just want to take this time to thank you for joining us. And we hope to see you again in a future webinar.